Hi everyone, let's talk about sanding 3D prints. Now, I know that sanding isn't everybody's favourite topic, but hopefully we can cover a few tips and tricks here that might make it at least a halfway pleasurable experience. So first things first, let's just talk about safety, which is if you're doing sanding on any project, you need to be wearing a filter mask. So I can't actually wear this during the demo to do anything live, because if I was wearing it, you wouldn't actually be able to hear what I was actually saying, but this is just a filter mask I've picked up from a local DIY shop. The second thing that I started wearing recently is a pair of gloves for doing sanding. So I don't know about you, but if you're doing sanding, my hands get wrecked by the end of the day. So I picked up these. These are sold as lightweight DIY gloves on eBay actually. I think they're actually motorsports gloves. They're not bad, they're quite lightweight. They're good for doing sort of medium or larger projects. You get a bit of tactile feedback. They're not so good for doing really small items that are a little bit fiddly, but they definitely save on my hands through the day when I've been doing a lot of sanding. Okay, so let's talk about materials. Okay, so let's talk about sandpaper first of all. Yeah, not very exciting. But believe it or not, I actually have I have a favourite sandpaper. So I've tried a few different sandpapers over the years and I've settled on this stuff. It's sold by B&Q. What I found with other sandpapers is that some of them, the sand actually separates from the paper after only using it for a short while, but this stuff it's a lot tougher, and anyway it kind of works for my projects. Okay, so what else? Actual materials that we're going to sand back. Okay, so car filler, spray putty. Now, spray putty is magical stuff. Okay, so I discovered this probably about 2 or 3 years ago from Michael Badley. He recommended it, and it is incredible. Okay, but I actually use a combination of car filler. This is Isopon 238. I use a combination of these two materials on my sanding project. So let's just have a little discussion about why that is the case, because I do it to save time as well as to improve the quality. Let's look at this 3D printer here. This is a Mandalorian blaster. I'm not sure if you can actually see this or not, but this actually has a fault line that's actually running along the middle of the print here. I only noticed this after it actually finished printing. This was actually destined to go in the bin, but I thought I'd actually use this as a demonstration piece for this. So let's just turn it over. What I've done here is I've actually applied a fine layer of car filler down the blaster. Now, this is the kind of thing that I would do on a project that I didn't want to reprint. Like if I'd printed this out, I might think, I'm not sure. And whenever you get a gap like this, it's indicative of maybe a structural problem inside the print. But if it's a large project like this dome here, and you've invested a lot of time into this, it could still be worthwhile saving it. So you might, and in actual fact, this dome did have actually a fault, an under extrusion fault line about this level here. A bit high, I can't remember now. We'll come to that in a moment. So anyway, so put on a bit of car filler, yeah, and it fills in that gap. Now, if you were applying spray putty to this blaster, you'd have to put on, I hear some people saying like they're up to like 7, 8, 9, 10 layers of spray putty, and they're sanding back, sanding back, sanding back, and they can still see a fault. My argument is that every project that I do, I put a layer of car filler on the whole thing. So first of all, if there's an obvious fault, it makes sense, I think, to put car filler, because the car filler is really, it's a heavy build substance as opposed to spray putty, which is, this is quite thick, but it's still a relatively thin layer, thicker than a paint, but certainly thinner than something like car filler. Car filler, you can really put this on, it'll set, it'll fill those gaps. Now there's something else that was really interesting. I only put this on about half an hour ago and it's now set. When I actually applied this car filler, I actually noticed there was a second fault just above it. Not surprising, because my nozzle, my printer was in need of unblocking. So this is interesting, because sometimes the faults that are there in a print they're not obvious immediately, and it's only after you start putting on your spray putty and sanding it back you start to actually see them. So the car filler, put a layer of that on, it fills in and fixes both of those problems, or at least goes a long way towards filling them in, to fixing them. The other thing, of course, is that you'll see there's lots of lines here anyway. Of course, when you're 3D printing, you get these lines, these layers. This is printed in just 0.3 millimeters. The dome here next to me, that's 0.2, and those are usually the layer heights that I generally print in. So the thing is, again, all those little lines that are on there, that's why we use the spray putty, right? Because we put the spray putty on to sand it back to fill those in. A layer of car filler does the equivalent of several coats of spray putty in one hit. The way that I work with the car filler is I will put a layer on. You can only use relatively small batches at a time. So, and again, it's also dependent upon the environment. So it's actually raining today. It's quite cool. But in the 2 weeks leading up to this, it's been really hot. And working with car filler has been impossible because it sets very, very quickly in high temperatures like that. So to be honest, days like that, I just don't bother. There's no point. But mix up the car filler, put it on in small batches, and then allow it to set. Now you can actually sand it relatively quickly. It's set ready to sand within 5-10 minutes, and it's optimum actually at that point to sand because it's still quite soft. You can go through it quite quickly and go down to the actual 3D print itself. And this is the other thing, when you're sanding 3D prints, don't sand into the print, you put something on it and then sand that back. Once you start seeing the lines coming through, stop, yeah? And if there's still too much detail from the actual print coming through, too many lines, then that's the time where you put more car filler on, or you put more spray put in. So always stand back to just the surface of the print. So after 5 or 10 minutes, the car filler it's set, but it's still soft enough that sanding is quick and relatively easy. Then, once you've sanded the whole project out, then you can leave it overnight, and the filler kind of properly hardens then. It seems to take a good sort of 12 hours, 24 hours to really get kind of tough. Then at that point, you can then go to your usual spray putty and put layers of this on. Now, you might then only need half as many coats. So the dome here on the side, that's had one layer of car filler over the whole thing. That was then sanded back. And then 2 or maybe I think 3 coats of spray putty, and I'm in the process of sanding that back. The top is sanded, and that's the first attempt to sand, and I possibly will put an additional coat of spray putty on there, and then it'll just be down to sanding. So let's actually talk about which sandpapers to use on what grits. So sandpapers, you get this kind of grit size. This is 40 grit, it's quite rough, and then you step up through. It gets finer and finer, so 120 and so on. Now. So 120, this is, believe it or not, my go-to sandpaper, this grit. Now that might surprise a lot of people because it might seem that this is quite coarse still. But this is the paper that I use at most levels of the process. So let's just kind of step back a little bit. So the first thing I actually do with the print, the raw print, is I key it in with a really low grit paper, 40 or 80. So I just run that over the surface. I'm not going to do that because I've not got my mask on. And I'm not looking to sand the actual print back at that point. I'm just looking to rough up the surface to give the car filler something to kind of grip onto, yeah? So key in the surface, brush it off, wipe it off, get the surface nice and clean, then knife on the car filler. And then I would then typically move to an 80 grit paper to actually then sand back the car filler, maybe a 120 paper at that point to get a slightly smoother surface. Then I would, again, brush it, wipe it, clean it off. I would then apply a coat or 2 of spray putty, and again I would continue with the 120. Now at this point I would kind of loop. I would go through a couple of coats of spray putty, sanding in between each time until I get a finish that kind of looks about right. You can usually hold up a print to the light and you can get the light to catch it, and you can usually see what's going on. The spray putty, I find, really helps to identify where you can see little holes. Now at this point, if you've sanded a couple of times, you put some spray putty on, and you can still see odd spots that aren't quite right. I don't mean like the whole print, I mean just little bits, like there's a dent here that didn't come out very well when it was printed. You glued something, and there's okay, stop and reapply car filler. Just mix up a small batch, put it into just that spot, yeah, knife it so it's relatively flat, let it set, okay, get your sandpaper out, 120, and just sand that one spot and then spray putty over the top of it and then sand that back. And it's a much quicker process than sanding the whole thing and sanding all of that off just to target one little tiny spot. It's easier just to go straight into that spot and just put a bit of car filler on there and then spray putty over the top of it. So you keep going with your spray putty, sanding in between. Let's talk about finer sandpapers. So I would only go to, okay, so this is like the finest sandpaper I own, right? Now this goes up to 600 grit. And to be honest, I don't actually use 600 grit on my projects. Believe it or not, the finest grit that I go to is 240 or 320 maximum, okay? And on big projects like this, large items, I probably don't go above 240. Now, that might surprise you. That might feel like I don't get a very good finish, but I get the finish that I'm kind of happy with. And once I actually put a primer and a top coat on, I think they kind of smooth things as well a little bit. Now, if you want to keep going, smoother and smoother and smoother, and you want to go to finer and finer sandpaper, do that, okay? Don't let anyone tell you that there's a right or a wrong way to tackle any project, but be open-minded to try different things out. So, like, maybe try out some of these sandpapers, maybe try a technique by putting some car filler on first and then spray putting. If you don't get on with it, ditch it, go back to the technique that does work for you. Okay, so let's just talk about this dome. So the dome actually had a fault in it. So I came down one morning and I could see that it was under extruding. I mean, I caught it luckily because it would have just stopped and then ruined the print. And from memory, I can't actually even remember where it was now. I think it was about this level here. So I paused the print in the garage and cleaned the nozzle, set it going again, and it recovered. But there was a fault running all the way around there. So there's two things. First of all, it looks really dreadful, right? Because this dome's supposed to be super smooth. And the second thing, I'm a bit worried about the kind of the structural integrity of it, how strong it's going to be. Because if this drops, that'll be where it's going to break. So the first thing I did was you can actually see where the fault is, because if I just angle this into the light catch, you see there's like a little shiny spot starts to appear. So there's like a donut, and what I've done is I've got some epoxy glue, Gorilla 2-part epoxy, and a silicone brush, and I just kind of put on like a lacquered layer, like kind of gooped it on there a bit, to hopefully strengthen that part of the print. So it's gone into where the filaments have started to separate out slightly, and there's a bit of a gap. I've also put it in dead centre here, because whenever you get these prints that get towards the middle, there's a lot of drooping, because obviously it's printing at less than 45 degrees. So I'm a bit happier about the strength of that. On the outside here, well, of course, I'm just putting car filler over the whole thing. So I put car filler around there, across the whole dome, and then sand it back. And of course, what I then see is a nice little white line going all the way around there, which is expected. Then I put spray putty over the whole thing, sand that back, and now you can't see it. So that, for me, I kind of feel like if I just kept on going with spray putty, I'd have probably been to like 7, 8, 9, 10 layers, and I'd have still seen a line there. I don't think, because I can't even see from the outside where that actually is now, I think it's done a pretty good job of covering up. Now that's the car filler doing that, not the spray putty. Spray putty goes on top to give the whole thing a consistent surface. So just talking about sanding, so I've only actually sanded about half of this of the spray putty so far. This is relatively unsanded at the moment here. It still looks quite good. One thing, as I mentioned, don't be afraid to revisit individual spots to put car filler on. So just at this point in the print, you can see you probably can't see this, but there's some slight kind of rippling here where the actual print underneath isn't kind of the smoothest. So, and the spray putty is really just coated that, and it's still come through. So if I sand that and I get so far and I think, I'm not making much of a difference there, I will just maybe sculpt the surface slightly, get some sandpaper and just scratch it a little bit to rough it up, get some car filler, and I'll just knife on a little layer of car filler, let it set, sand that back, and then put some more spray putty over the top, and hopefully it'll look an awful lot better. So that's quite common, especially in a larger project like that, for me to do this. That, as I say, so let's just go through the steps actually. So raw print, key it in with a 40 or an 80 grit paper, car filler over the whole thing, sand that with an 80 or a 120 grit paper, then spray putty, 2 or 3 coats, sanding each of those with a 120 paper. I might sand back the spray putty with, let's say, a 240 if I want to go for something really smooth, before I then move on to paints. Yeah. Okay. So let's just talk about paints briefly. So, someone asked me recently about, do you prime on top of spray putty, because is this a primer? And I don't know. I've not got a clue. I always put primer on top of anything I'm going to paint. A primer is what I think gives me the best adhesion of the paint onto the project. So no matter whether this is a good primer or not, I always follow with this. So the dome here, once I'm happy with the finish, with the sanding, so I've gone to 240, 320 grit paper, and I'm like, I can hold it up to the light and it looks okay. Then at that point I go, right, okay, cool, clean it, brush it off, maybe hoover it, really try and get it nice and clean, then put on a coat of grey primer. And it's just worth noting that sometimes the project, I get to this stage, and even at this stage, I notice a few little things that I'm not quite happy with. I might just nip in there and just apply a tiny dot of filler and just sand that back in a very localized spot. Hopefully, I don't have to do that because that actually means I've missed it. But even at that point, don't be afraid to be objective, stand back, look at your project and think, you know what, I can see a little bit of something not quite right there. I need to go in and fix it. So yeah, get a coat of grey primer, that dries overnight, and then top coat of paint, lacquer, and good to go. So hopefully this video has been of help to you. If you've got any questions, ask away. Keep sanding.